The courthouse gleamed beneath rows of cold fluorescent lights long before the city awakened. A polished marble floor reflected every ceiling panel with mirror-like precision, while the faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the still morning air. Rubber wheels from a gray janitor's cart whispered across the stone, breaking the silence with a gentle rhythm that echoed through empty hallways lined with towering oak courtroom doors. Outside, rain tapped softly against tall windows, blurring the skyline into streaks of silver and charcoal. Inside, one man moved carefully through the enormous building, invisible to nearly everyone who would arrive within the hour. Yet hidden beneath his faded maintenance uniform rested a truth that, if uncovered, would shake the very foundations of the courthouse itself. No one who glanced at Daniel Mercer that morning could have imagined why a man with such steady hands had chosen a life that asked him never to be noticed. Daniel guided the mop with slow, practiced movements, never rushing despite the enormous workload awaiting him before sunrise. Every stroke across the marble was deliberate. Every brass railing he polished caught the pale white light until it glowed like gold. His uniform had been washed so many times that the navy fabric had faded almost to gray, but every crease remained perfectly pressed. His work boots were old enough to remember winters long forgotten, yet they shone with quiet care. People often assumed neatness came from pride. For Daniel, it came from gratitude. He believed every task deserved respect, whether it involved examining evidence in a laboratory or removing muddy footprints from courthouse floors. Few understood that belief. Fewer still understood him. The courthouse gradually awakened around him. Heating vents exhaled warm air into corridors that had been chilled through the night. Elevator cables hummed somewhere above. Coffee drifted from the security office downstairs as the first deputies reported for duty. Daniel greeted each of them with the same gentle smile. "Morning." Most smiled back. Some nodded without looking. Others barely noticed him at all. He never took offense. Invisibility had become strangely peaceful. 15 years earlier, life had taught him that people often revealed their true character when they believed someone beneath them could offer nothing in return. His phone vibrated quietly inside his pocket. The wallpaper showed a photograph of a little girl bundled in an oversized winter coat, smiling with missing front teeth while holding an ice cream cone almost larger than her face. The picture was old. Very old. He looked at it every morning. A new message appeared. "Morning, Dad. Big hearing today. Wish me luck. Love you?" Daniel smiled. His reply contained only 6 words. "Always proud of you. Stay kind." He slipped the phone away before returning to work. Kindness, he believed, required far more courage than anger. Outside courtroom 7, he paused to straighten a framed portrait hanging slightly crooked against the wall. The adjustment measured less than half an inch. Still, he noticed. He always noticed. The smallest details often carried the greatest consequences. At 8 o'clock sharp, the building transformed. Shoes clicked rapidly across polished floors. Attorneys hurried past carrying leather briefcases overflowing with files. Assistants balanced trays of coffee while clerks wheeled carts stacked high with legal documents. Reporters gathered near the ceremonial courtroom where one of the state's most celebrated judges would soon address visiting officials during an annual Judicial Excellence Conference. The courthouse buzzed with carefully controlled urgency. Daniel quietly pushed his cleaning cart toward the ceremonial wing. He intended only to replace a trash liner before guests arrived. Nothing more. Inside the grand courtroom, workers adjusted cameras beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered warm light across rows of polished wooden benches. Rich mahogany walls reflected decades of legal tradition, while enormous flags stood motionless behind the elevated judicial bench. Judge Victor Langford stood near the front speaking confidently with prominent attorneys, politicians, and television reporters. Everything about him projected authority. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver cufflinks caught the light each time he gestured. His voice carried effortlessly across the room, practiced through decades of commanding attention. People laughed before he finished jokes. People nodded before he completed opinions. Power had become second nature. Daniel kept his eyes lowered as he guided his cart quietly along the rear aisle. He never intended to interrupt anyone. But one will struck an uneven edge where carpet met marble. The bucket rocked. A cleaning bottle slipped. It landed harmlessly on the floor. The small plastic sound echoed far louder than it deserved. Conversation stopped. Dozens of heads turned. Judge Langford slowly looked toward the back of the courtroom. His smile disappeared. "And what exactly?" he asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Is this?" Daniel immediately bent down, retrieved the bottle, and placed it back inside the cart. "My apologies, Your Honor," he said calmly. "I was only replacing the waste bin." Langford walked toward him with measured steps. Television cameras remained recording preparations. Lawyers watched with quiet curiosity. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. "You were listening," Langford declared. "No, sir." "You expect everyone here to believe that?" Daniel remained silent. The judge circled the cleaning cart. "Open every compartment." Several people shifted uncomfortably. Daniel obeyed without hesitation. Fresh trash liners. Glass cleaner. Paper towels. Extra gloves. Nothing else. Langford folded his arms. "You know," he said with a thin smile, "people sometimes forget their place. They begin thinking proximity to important conversations makes them important too." A few uneasy laughs escaped from the crowd. Daniel neither reacted nor lowered his eyes. He simply stood quietly beside his cart. Langford's voice grew louder. "This ceremony is for people who uphold justice." He glanced deliberately at Daniel's uniform. "Not those who polish the floors beneath it." Silence spread through the courtroom. The words hung in the air with surprising weight. Daniel felt every pair of eyes settle upon him. Some faces showed embarrassment. Others pity. Most simply watched. He could have answered. He could have said far more than anyone there expected. Instead, he reached down and straightened the slightly twisted name badge pinned to his faded uniform. Then he spoke softly. "I'm sorry if I disrupted your morning." Nothing else. No anger. No excuses. No pride. Only dignity. Judge Langford dismissed him with a careless wave. "Security. Escort him out until preparations are complete." Two deputies approached reluctantly. Neither looked comfortable. Daniel picked up his cart without protest. Its rubber wheels squeaked quietly across the marble floor as he disappeared through the courtroom doors. Behind him, conversation slowly resumed. Ahead of him, the hallway felt colder than before. He stopped beside a tall window overlooking the rain-soaked courthouse steps. For just a moment, he closed his eyes. Not because he had been insulted. Because the judge's words reminded him of another courtroom. Another lifetime. Another promise he had sworn never to break. He opened his eyes and quietly resumed polishing the hallway floor. No one noticed the calm determination that had settled behind them. No one recognized the steady hands that once held evidence capable of changing history. And no one, not even Judge Victor Langford, could have imagined that the quiet janitor they had humiliated that morning had already seen something inside that courtroom that would soon unravel everything the powerful judge believed was untouchable. The courtroom settled beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers as rain continued to drum softly against the towering windows, each drop tracing silver paths down the glass. The polished mahogany benches filled with attorneys in tailored suits, journalists clutching notebooks, law students eager to witness the annual judicial conference, and public officials whose conversations blended into a low, sophisticated murmur. The air carried the aroma of fresh coffee, expensive cologne, and old paper, while beneath it lingered the faint scent of the cleaning solution Daniel Mercer had used only minutes before. Though security had escorted him from the ceremonial chamber, his work had not ended. He quietly resumed polishing the marble corridor outside, listening to the muffled voices beyond the heavy oak doors without paying them any attention. The humiliation still echoed in his memory, but he refused to let bitterness settle where peace had taken years to grow. Inside, Judge Victor Langford stood confidently behind the elevated bench, commanding the room with practiced ease. His speech celebrated integrity, excellence, and public trust. Every carefully chosen sentence earned approving nods from distinguished guests. Television cameras recorded every polished word. Daniel continued working. He had long ago learned that speeches often sounded most convincing in buildings where truths struggled hardest to survive. The conference proceeded without interruption until an anxious court clerk hurried toward the bench carrying a thick evidence binder. Her face had drained of color. She whispered urgently into Langford's ear. The judge frowned. Within seconds, the atmosphere changed. The quiet confidence that had filled the courtroom gave way to uneasy whispers. A prosecutor rose from counsel's table. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "there appears to be a discrepancy regarding Exhibit 27. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. The exhibit contained forensic evidence central to a widely publicized financial fraud trial scheduled to begin that afternoon. Without it, months of preparation could collapse. Judge Langford's expression hardened. "What discrepancy? The chain of custody documentation doesn't match the laboratory seal." The courtroom stirred. Clerks hurried between tables. Reporters immediately began writing notes. A senior bailiff examined the sealed evidence container before quietly shaking his head. "The identification number is correct," he muttered, "but the seal was applied after the final signature." Silence settled uneasily across the room. Experts leaned closer. No one offered an explanation. Outside the courtroom, Daniel paused as one of the courthouse maintenance radios crackled with the request. "Custodial assistance needed in ceremonial court," he answered automatically. "On my way." Minutes later, he carefully pushed his cleaning cart back through the same doorway from which he had been escorted earlier. This time no one looked at him with contempt. They barely looked at him at all. Every eye remained fixed upon the evidence container resting beneath bright courtroom lights. Daniel quietly replaced a waste liner near the rear wall. He intended to leave immediately. Then he noticed something. Not the evidence itself. The table beneath it. A tiny gray fiber clung to the polished wood beside the sealed package. His eyes narrowed almost instinctively. His attention shifted toward the evidence tape. The adhesive reflected light differently along one edge. Someone had peeled it back. Very carefully. Almost perfectly. But not perfectly enough. Daniel stood motionless. Old habits refused to disappear. Years of disciplined observation awakened before he could stop them. He glanced toward the clerk holding the documentation. Then toward the evidence log. Then back to the seal. His breathing remained calm. His heartbeat did not. A young prosecutor noticed him watching. "What?" she asked impatiently. Daniel hesitated. He had promised himself long ago never to step back into this world. Not unless there was no other choice. "There may be a mistake," he said quietly. Several attorneys turned. Judge Langford immediately recognized him. "You again?" Daniel remained respectful. "I'm sorry to interrupt." "You already have." Daniel nodded once. "I believe the evidence seal wasn't replaced after the laboratory inspection." A skeptical laugh escaped one attorney. "And how?" another asked. "Would a janitor know that?" Daniel answered without emotion. "Because genuine laboratory tape fractures differently under fluorescent lighting." The room grew still. He continued. "This edge separated once before." He pointed carefully without touching the package. "The adhesive stretched unevenly. Someone reheated it before pressing it back into place." The prosecutor blinked. A forensic technician stepped closer. He adjusted the overhead examination lamp. His confident expression slowly faded. "He's right." No one spoke. The technician leaned nearer with a magnifying lens. "The adhesive crystallization doesn't match the original factory pattern." Another expert joined him. Then another. Within moments, 3 experienced forensic specialists examined the container in complete silence. The youngest finally whispered words that seemed almost impossible. "It was reopened." No chair moved. No paper rustled. Even the reporters forgot to write. The enormous courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the gentle tapping of rain against the windows sounded deafening. Every eye slowly turned toward Daniel Mercer. The quiet janitor. The man Judge Langford had publicly dismissed less than an hour earlier. No one understood how he had seen what trained professionals had overlooked. No one understood why he spoke with the certainty of someone who had spent years inside forensic laboratories rather than pushing a mop through courthouse hallways. Judge Langford stared at Daniel with narrowed eyes. For the first time that morning, certainty disappeared from his face. The silence lingered like a physical weight. No one hurried to fill it. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, their steady buzz suddenly louder than the conversations that had vanished only moments before. Rain continued tracing slow paths down the tall courthouse windows, and somewhere in the distance, an elevator bell chimed before fading into the stillness. Every face in the courtroom remained fixed on Daniel Mercer. Judge Victor Langford broke the silence first. "Explain yourself." His voice was calm, but the confidence that had defined it earlier had developed a barely noticeable crack. Daniel kept his hands folded in front of him. "There isn't much to explain, Your Honor." Langford took one deliberate step forward. "There certainly is." Daniel glanced once toward the evidence container before returning his eyes to the judge. "The adhesive was reheated after it had already been sealed. It changed the way the surface reflected the overhead light. The fiber beside the package is also inconsistent with the cloth used inside the evidence laboratory. It most likely came from a synthetic courtroom glove rather than a forensic workstation." Several forensic specialists immediately bent closer to inspect the tiny gray fiber. One carefully collected it with tweezers. Another examined it beneath a portable microscope. Seconds passed. Then the senior examiner slowly removed his glasses. "He is correct." Another wave of silence spread across the courtroom. The prosecutor looked from the evidence to Daniel with open disbelief. "How could you possibly notice something like that from across the room?" Daniel answered honestly. "I've always paid attention to small things." Nothing more. No boasting. No explanation. His humility somehow made the answer even more unsettling. The young law students whispered among themselves. One reporter quietly lowered his camera, forgetting for a moment that he had been recording. Judge Langford watched Daniel with a new expression. Curiosity. Followed almost immediately by suspicion. People did not acquire that level of forensic observation while cleaning courthouse floors. Something about the quiet janitor no longer fit the story everyone had accepted. Langford folded his hands behind his back. "Mr. Mercer." "Yes, Your Honor." "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 15 years. "And before that?" A brief pause. "I had another profession." "What profession?" Daniel met the judge's eyes without hostility. "It was a long time ago." "That wasn't my question." Daniel remained silent. The hesitation was enough. Langford noticed it immediately. "So there is something you're choosing not to tell this court?" "I simply don't believe my past is relevant." "On the contrary," Langford replied, his tone sharpening, "I believe it may be extremely relevant." The courtroom atmosphere shifted once again. What had begun as admiration slowly transformed into uncertainty. People started asking themselves the same question. Who was Daniel Mercer? The judge turned toward the courthouse security supervisor. "I want every person who has accessed this evidence logged and interviewed." "Yes, Your Honor." "And include Mr. Mercer." Several heads turned in surprise. The prosecutor frowned. "Your Honor, he just helped identify the problem." "Exactly," Langford replied. "He noticed details experienced professionals missed. Either Mr. Mercer possesses extraordinary knowledge," he allowed the sentence to hang, "or extraordinary familiarity." The implication landed heavily. Daniel understood it instantly. The room, which moments earlier had looked at him with newfound respect, now regarded him with cautious uncertainty. The emotional tide had shifted. Again. A deputy approached Daniel politely. "Sir, we'd like you to remain available for questions." Daniel nodded. "Of course." He offered no resistance. No complaint. He simply wheeled his janitor's cart toward the side of the courtroom and quietly waited. As technicians continued examining the evidence, Langford stepped aside with his chief clerk. His voice dropped low enough that only those nearest could hear. "I want everything on Mercer." The clerk looked confused. "Everything?" "Employment records. Previous addresses. Education. Military. Professional licenses. If he has a past, I want it before sunset." The clerk hesitated. "Do you think he's involved?" Langford stared across the courtroom at Daniel, who stood silently beside his mop bucket, watching the rain through the tall windows. "I don't know." His eyes narrowed. "But men don't hide that kind of knowledge without a reason." Across the room, Daniel sensed the weight of the judge's gaze. He knew exactly what came next. Questions. Records. Old names. Forgotten files. 15 years of carefully guarded silence had begun to crack. His phone vibrated quietly inside his pocket. A single message appeared from Emily. "Big hearing finished. Calling tonight. Miss you, Dad." Daniel smiled faintly before locking the screen. He whispered so softly that no one nearby heard the words. "I'm proud of you." Then he slipped the phone away. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. Inside, something far more dangerous had begun. Judge Langford believed he was investigating a janitor. He had no idea he had just started digging into the life of the very man whose forgotten past held the first thread capable of unraveling everything he had spent decades building. Cold morning rain washed across the courthouse windows in slow, uneven streams, softening the outlines of the city beyond while the building itself seemed heavier than it had only a day before. The marble corridors that usually echoed with hurried footsteps now carried quieter sounds, whispered conversations, restrained curiosity, and the occasional click of a security radio. The familiar scent of floor polish mixed with stale coffee and damp wool coats, drifting in from the entrance. Daniel Mercer walked those same hallways with his janitor's cart beside him, but something had changed. Invisible glances followed him from every doorway. The same people who had ignored him for 15 years were suddenly watching every movement he made. News traveled quickly inside a courthouse. By mid-morning, nearly everyone had heard the strange story. The janitor had discovered a flaw that veteran forensic specialists had missed. Some called it remarkable. Others called it suspicious. Daniel called it unfortunate. He had spent 15 years making certain no one looked twice at him. Now the entire building was asking the same question. Who is Daniel Mercer? He pushed his cart into a quiet maintenance room beneath the eastern staircase and carefully returned every bottle, brush, and cloth to its proper place. Order had always helped him think. When life became uncertain, small routines reminded him that not everything was beyond control. As he closed the cabinet door, an old photograph slipped from the pocket of his worn notebook. He picked it up gently. The edges had become soft with age. A little girl stood in the center of the picture wearing a coat several sizes too large, clutching a paper cup of hot chocolate with both hands. Snow rested on her tangled hair, yet she smiled as though she had been handed the greatest treasure in the world. Emily. She had been 8 years old. Cold. Hungry. Alone. Daniel remembered that winter afternoon with painful clarity. She had been sitting outside a closed bookstore beneath a broken street lamp, pretending to read pages from a water-damaged children's book someone had thrown away. Most pedestrians had walked past without slowing. Some had dropped loose change into the cup beside her without meeting her eyes. Daniel had done something different. He had sat beside her. He had asked her favorite book. Not whether she needed money. Not where her parents were. Only her favorite story. She had looked at him with cautious eyes and whispered, "The ones where someone comes back." That answer had changed 2 lives. A sharp knock interrupted the memory. "Mr. Mercer?" Daniel slipped the photograph back into his notebook. "Come in." A courthouse investigator stepped inside. "Judge Langford would like to ask you a few more questions." Daniel nodded once. "I expected that." The investigator led him upstairs to a small conference room overlooking the courthouse square. Gray clouds hung low over the rooftops, and rain continued falling in steady sheets. Judge Langford waited beside the window. A thick personnel file rested on the polished table. Daniel recognized it immediately. His employment records. Langford did not invite him to sit. "You've lived a remarkably quiet life." "I've tried to." "No college listed." Daniel remained silent. "No previous employers before joining courthouse maintenance." Silence again. "No military service." Another page turned. "And yet yesterday you identified forensic tampering more quickly than certified specialists." Langford slowly closed the file. "Interesting," Daniel answered calmly. "I notice details. People don't learn chain of custody analysis by noticing details." The judge stepped closer. "They learn it somewhere." Daniel looked toward the rain-covered window. "There was a time when my life was very different." "What time?" "A lifetime ago." Langford's patience disappeared. "I don't appreciate riddles. I'm not offering one." "Then answer me." Daniel met the judge's eyes. "I left that life behind." "Why?" The question lingered between them. For several long seconds neither man spoke. Finally Daniel answered with quiet honesty. "Because someone I loved paid the price for my work." Langford studied him carefully. The words sounded genuine. But they raised even more questions. "What work?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm sorry. I can't answer that." The judge's expression hardened once more. "You can't. Or you won't?" Before Daniel could respond, the conference room door burst open. A breathless court clerk hurried inside. "Your Honor!" She struggled to catch her breath. "The evidence technician has finished examining the container." "And?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "They found fingerprints." Langford frowned. "Whose?" She swallowed nervously. "They don't know yet. But there's something else." "What?" "The security footage from the evidence archive." She hesitated. "Has disappeared." The room became perfectly still. Langford slowly turned toward Daniel. His eyes no longer carried curiosity. Only suspicion. And for the first time in 15 years, Daniel realized the quiet life he had built to protect his daughter was beginning to collapse. The words settled over the conference room like a storm cloud refusing to move. "The footage is gone?" Judge Langford asked, his voice suddenly stripped of its polished composure. The clerk nodded. "The archive server shows a gap of 23 minutes. The recording covering the evidence vault was deleted sometime during the night." Every pair of eyes turned toward Daniel. He neither protested nor looked away. He had spent years studying human behavior. He knew exactly what suspicion looked like when it searched for the easiest target. And the easiest target was almost always the man no one expected to defend himself. Langford folded his arms. "Mr. Mercer, where were you between 8 and 9 o'clock yesterday evening?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "At home." "Can anyone confirm that?" He paused. "No." The answer hung heavily in the room. The judge nodded slowly, almost as though the silence itself confirmed his conclusion. "I see." Within minutes, courthouse investigators requested Daniel's identification badge, maintenance keys, and work-issued radio. The requests were polite, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. The janitor who had quietly cleaned these halls for 15 years was no longer being treated as a trusted employee. He was being treated as a suspect. By afternoon, word had spread through every floor of the courthouse. Whispers followed Daniel wherever he walked. "Maybe he knew too much. They say he used to work in law enforcement." "No," someone said, intelligence. "I heard he tampered with evidence." Rumors required no proof. Only repetition. Daniel packed the few belongings from his maintenance locker into a worn canvas bag. A spare pair of gloves. An old thermos. A paperback novel with folded corners. And the faded photograph of a smiling little girl standing in the snow. He brushed a thumb gently across the picture. Emily. The frightened child he had promised would never again wonder whether someone would come back for her. He remembered the night he signed the adoption papers. He had owned almost nothing. No large house. No prestigious title. No certainty about the future. Only a promise. You will never be alone again. That promise had become the center of his life. Everything else, including the career he had abandoned, had become expendable. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The cold air smelled of wet pavement and fresh earth as Daniel stepped onto the courthouse stairs carrying his canvas bag. Halfway down the steps, 2 investigators approached. Daniel Mercer? Yes. One officer unfolded an official document. By order of the court, you're being detained for questioning regarding possible evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and unauthorized access to secured judicial property. People stopped walking. Lawyers. Reporters. Court employees. The same crowd that had witnessed his humiliation now watched another public fall. Cameras appeared almost instantly. Flashes reflected across the damp stone steps. No one shouted. No one defended him. Only the clicking of camera shutters filled the silence. Daniel slowly offered his hands. I won't resist. One investigator hesitated before placing the handcuffs around his wrists. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Daniel simply nodded. It's your job. Even now, he refused to let another person's duty become a reason for bitterness. Inside the holding cell, the steel bench felt colder than the marble floors he had polished every morning. The fluorescent light overhead flickered softly. For the first time in many years, Daniel allowed himself to remember. He remembered forensic laboratories filled with bright white lights. He remembered long nights examining fingerprints beneath microscopes. He remembered testifying against powerful men who believed the law belonged to them. He remembered the phone call that changed everything. His wife's car. The collision. The official explanation. And the quiet warning delivered days later. Walk away, or the little girl is next. So he had disappeared. Not out of fear for himself. For Emily. He buried his name. Destroyed his career. Accepted a life where no one asked questions. It had been enough. Until now. A guard approached the cell. Mr. Mercer. Daniel stood. You have a visitor. I wasn't expecting one. The guard unlocked the door but smiled faintly. I don't think anyone expected her. At the far end of the visitor's corridor stood a woman in a navy suit, rainwater still glistening on the shoulders of her tailored coat. A leather briefcase rested beside her, and her posture carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to speaking before judges. She looked directly at Daniel. Her eyes softened. For a brief moment, she was no longer one of the nation's most respected appellate attorneys. She was simply the little girl who had once asked him whether anyone ever came back. Dad, she said quietly. I came. Daniel closed his eyes for the briefest moment. Not because he had lost hope. Because the promise he made 15 years earlier had just been returned to him. And somewhere above them, inside the same courthouse where powerful people believed they controlled the truth, the first cracks had already begun to spread through a foundation built on carefully hidden lies. Morning sunlight filtered through the towering courthouse windows for the first time in days, casting long bands of gold across the polished marble floor where Daniel Mercer had spent 15 quiet years working without recognition. Dust floated gently through the warm light, while the familiar scent of old wood, polished brass, and fresh coffee filled the grand courtroom. Every seat in the public gallery had been occupied long before the hearing began. Reporters lined the rear wall with cameras poised. Attorneys whispered behind neatly arranged stacks of legal documents. Court officers stood shoulder to shoulder along the side aisles. It was the same courtroom where Daniel had once been mocked, searched, and dismissed as nothing more than a janitor. Only now, every eye waited for a very different reason. Daniel entered wearing the same calm expression he had carried throughout every hardship. Though the handcuffs had been removed, the weight of accusation still followed him through the room. Some spectators lowered their eyes. Others watched with open curiosity. Judge Victor Langford entered moments later, his black judicial robe flowing neatly behind him. He appeared composed, but beneath the practiced confidence rested a growing unease. The missing surveillance footage had still not been recovered. The fingerprints recovered from the evidence container remained unidentified. Too many questions had begun circling too many people. The bailiff called the room to order. This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with formal charges against Mr. Daniel Mercer. Before anyone could continue, the rear courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A woman dressed in a navy suit walked confidently down the center aisle, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a neatly organized case file in the other. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and completely without hesitation. She stopped beside Daniel. He looked at her with quiet pride. She offered him the smallest smile. Then she faced the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady enough to command the entire courtroom without raising its volume. "My name is Emily Mercer. I am appearing as counsel for the defense." A murmur swept through the gallery. Several attorneys immediately recognized her. One whispered to another, "That's Emily Mercer. The appellate specialist? The one who overturned 3 wrongful convictions last year?" Reporters hurriedly scribbled new notes. Judge Langford studied her carefully. "I was not informed new counsel would be appearing." Emily opened her briefcase. "You've been informed now." Her confidence unsettled him. Professional. Measured. Completely controlled. The same qualities Daniel had spent years teaching her without ever realizing how fully she had inherited them. Langford nodded stiffly. "Very well. Proceed." Emily placed several sealed folders on the evidence table. "I intend to demonstrate that my client neither tampered with evidence nor accessed the secured archive." The prosecutor frowned. "And how exactly do you intend to do that?" Emily answered by sliding a document across the table. "By beginning with something everyone overlooked." The courtroom became quiet. Again. She projected an enlarged image of the evidence container onto the courtroom screen. "This is the seal examined yesterday." Everyone nodded. Emily continued. "Notice this microscopic scratch near the locking clasp." The forensic technicians leaned forward. She changed to another image. "This photograph was taken 6 months earlier during an unrelated audit." Gasps spread softly across the room. The same scratch appeared. In exactly the same place. The evidence container itself, Emily explained calmly, was replaced. A forensic examiner stood. "That's impossible." Emily met his eyes. "No." She clicked the remote again. "It only appears impossible until someone compares maintenance records, transportation logs, and laboratory inventory reports." She produced 3 official documents. Each one carried certified signatures. Each one supported the previous. The courtroom grew steadily quieter. Even Judge Langford leaned forward. Emily continued. "The container introduced into evidence yesterday is not the original container delivered from the state laboratory." The prosecutor looked stunned. "How can you prove that?" Emily removed a small transparent evidence bag. Inside rested a worn metal inventory tag. "My father found this beneath a storage shelf 3 weeks ago while cleaning the archive." Daniel looked at her with surprise. She had never told him. "I submitted it for independent forensic examination." She handed the report to the court clerk. "The identification number matches the original transport container reported missing during inventory reconciliation 8 months ago." Silence. One technician slowly examined the report before looking toward the judge. "The document is authentic." Judge Langford's expression tightened. For the first time since this investigation began, events were no longer moving according to his expectations. Emily calmly closed one folder and opened another. "And Your Honor." She paused just long enough for every person in the courtroom to focus completely upon her next words. "This case was never about a janitor." She turned toward Daniel. "It was about making sure no one discovered why someone needed to replace that evidence container in the first place." The room fell into a silence heavier than any accusation. Every eye shifted toward Judge Langford. His composed expression remained unchanged. Only his hands betrayed him. For the first time that morning, they trembled. The silence lingered so long that even the old courthouse clock seemed reluctant to mark another second. Judge Victor Langford kept his hands folded tightly on the bench, but the confidence that had once commanded every room had begun to unravel. Reporters lowered their cameras, sensing that the next few moments would matter more than any photograph. The same attorneys who had once laughed at the quiet janitor now watched with expressions of cautious disbelief. Emily Mercer stood without triumph. She had not come to humiliate anyone. She had come to reveal the truth. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "the substituted evidence container was only one piece of a much larger pattern." She opened the final folder in her briefcase. Inside were certified bank records, archived maintenance reports, digital forensic analyses, and sworn affidavits gathered over nearly 4 years. "I began investigating several overturned convictions after discovering identical irregularities in evidence handling. Every trail eventually led to this courthouse." She placed a timeline on the courtroom screen. Colored lines connected dates, storage transfers, missing surveillance files, and judicial rulings stretching back almost 2 decades. A quiet murmur swept through the gallery. Emily continued. "Every time evidence disappeared, every time chain of custody documentation was altered, every time surveillance footage was conveniently lost, one name repeatedly appeared on the authorization records." She looked directly at Judge Langford. "Judge Victor Langford." The courtroom fell completely silent. No whispered conversations. No rustling papers. Only the soft hum of the air conditioning filled the enormous chamber. The prosecutor slowly rose to his feet. "Your Honor," his voice faltered, "is this documentation authentic?" Before Langford could answer, the courtroom doors opened once again. 2 investigators from the State Judicial Integrity Division entered with measured steps. Behind them walked the chief forensic examiner carrying a sealed evidence case. The lead investigator addressed the court. "We have completed an independent verification of Ms. Mercer's evidence." He placed the sealed case on the clerk's desk. "The financial records, forensic findings, and recovered backup server logs are authentic." Another wave of stunned silence spread through the courtroom. The investigator continued. "We also recovered the deleted surveillance footage from an off-site backup server." A large monitor illuminated. The restored video began to play. The courtroom watched in complete silence. The recording showed the evidence archive late at night. A senior administrative official entered carrying the original evidence container. Minutes later, another man arrived. Judge Langford. The timestamp was unmistakable. The footage showed him authorizing the replacement of the container before leaving with the original. No explanation could erase what every witness had just seen. Judge Langford's shoulders lowered. For the first time in decades, he looked like an ordinary man confronting the consequences of his own choices. The lead investigator stepped forward. "Judge Victor Langford, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and abuse of judicial authority." No one moved. The same courtroom that had once watched Daniel Mercer escorted away now witnessed another man leave under guard. This time, no one laughed. This time, no one looked away. As Langford passed Daniel, he slowed. For a moment, it seemed he wanted to speak. Instead, he lowered his eyes and continued toward the exit. The heavy courtroom doors closed behind him. The sound echoed through the chamber. Then came something Daniel had not expected. The chief judge stood. He looked toward Daniel with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Mercer." The elderly judge paused before continuing. "On behalf of this court, I offer our deepest apology." No elaborate speech followed. None was needed. Sometimes a sincere apology carried more weight than 1,000 carefully chosen words. The courtroom rose to its feet. Not because protocol required it. Because respect did. Daniel remained exactly as he had always been. Quiet. Humble. Steady. Emily walked to her father and gently embraced him. For a brief moment, the courtroom disappeared. There were no judges. No reporters. No cameras. Only a father and the little girl who had once believed no one would ever come back for her. "I kept my promise," Daniel whispered. Emily smiled through grateful tears. "So did I." Weeks later, Daniel was formally offered the position of director of the newly established Court Integrity Commission, a role created to strengthen transparency and public trust throughout the judicial system. He thanked the committee. Then he declined. "I've learned," he said with a gentle smile, "that titles don't determine whether someone serves justice. Character does." Instead, he accepted a quieter role mentoring young forensic investigators and courthouse employees, teaching them that the smallest overlooked detail could protect the greatest truth. Each morning, he still arrived before sunrise. He still greeted security officers by name. He still paused to straighten the crooked picture frames that others walked past without noticing. Only now, people greeted him differently. Not because he had become more valuable. Because they had finally learned to see the value that had always been there. And Emily never forgot the lesson her father had taught her on the cold winter day he first sat beside a frightened little girl instead of walking past. In the end, the greatest measure of a person is never the uniform they wear, the title they hold, or the applause they receive. It is the quiet courage to choose integrity when no one is watching, for dignity does not come from being recognized, but from remaining true to who you are long before the world finally learns your name.